Hello, America. We need to talk. For as long as any of us can remember, most people who vote in the United States have voted for one of the two political parties, the Democrats and the Republicans. We are trained to believe that both of these political parties are diametrically opposed to one another. Nothing could be further from the truth. Both political parties are two wings of the same bird, two legs for the same model of jackboot. The parties themselves are merely puppets who carry out the agenda of whoever is paying them. Sometimes they're paid to win, sometimes they're paid to lose. However, both political parties work together to benefit their donors, which has the effect of screwing over the people in general, at home and abroad. A website, opensecrets.org, shows users a list of organizations, how much they donated to each political party, as well as shows each politician and who they took money from. On their top organization contributors page, they state, totals on this page reflect donations from employees of the organization, its PAC, and in some cases its own treasury. These totals include all campaign contributions to federal candidates, parties, political action committees, including super PACs, federal 527 organizations, and carry committees. We can see some interesting patterns here. Some organizations give exclusively to one party or another, but many of them donate nearly the same amount to each political party, at least within the 60%, 40% range. For example, the National Association of Realtors, AT&T, Goldman Sachs, Blue Cross Blue Shield, Citigroup, Comcast, JP Morgan Chase, General Electric, Microsoft, Lockheed Martin, Bank of America, and many more. Most people like to talk about how the two main political parties are different from one another, but in this analysis we want to focus on what makes them similar and which people and organizations benefit from it. Here are some areas where the Democrats and the Republicans have similar policies. Are these policies the right thing for our country or the world?
Iraqis have a chance to forge their own destiny. That's part of what makes us special as Americans. Unlike the old empires, we don't make these sacrifices for territory or for resources. We do it because it's right.
Directly and indirectly, the United States has killed an estimated 20 million people in over 30 nations since World War II. The U.S. also maintains over 900 military bases abroad. The empire has grown under both political parties. Is it right? In 2014, Gallup International conducted a poll asking over 66,000 participants from 65 countries who they thought the biggest threat to world peace was. By far, the U.S. took the cake. These were the results laid out on a world map. What has the United States done under the leadership and policies of both political parties to earn the title of biggest threat to world peace? Initiating wars, conflict, and chaos around the world to keep the conflict constantly going in order to provide profits to the military defense companies and mercenary groups, as well as other companies that manage resources such as oil and natural gas. The United States has been doing this for decades, under both Democrat and Republican administrations. Let's take Iran, for example. In the early 1950s, the U.S. interfered in Iran's government by initiating a CIA coup and replacing a democratically elected prime minister, Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh, with a monarch, the Shah. This set the stage for the Iran we see today, becoming the Islamic Republic of Iran. Without U.S. interference, Iran would be a different country today. This short video gives a brief timeline of U.S. interference in Iran.
For most Americans, the story begins in 1979, with the Iranian Revolution and the hostage crisis. A group of revolutionary university students took over the American embassy in Tehran and held 52 diplomats hostage for 444 days. To help burn this into the American narrative, the news show Nightline was created, with a nightly tally of the number of days since the crisis started. But to really understand, we have to go back to 1953, which is where the story begins for most Iranians. This was the year that the U.S. overthrew Iran's democracy and installed the Shah, a pro-U.S. dictator. In 1951, Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh was the first elected official who was appointed as Prime Minister of Iran by popular demand. He saw that the wealth needed to build Iran was leaving the country because over the past 50 years its vast oil reserves were under British control at the hands of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, later to become BP, or British Petroleum. So Mossadegh became hugely popular for nationalizing the oil industry and taking back the oil. Hugely popular at home, but quite unpopular with the British government. Britain took Iran to the World Court over the matter and lost. They tried to hit Iran's economy by blockading the Gulf and halting trade. They tried to convince the U.S. to assist with regime change, but then President Truman was not interested. However, when U.S. President Eisenhower took office in 1953, Britain was able to persuade him under the Cold War pretext that Mossadegh relied on Iran's Communist Party for power. The newly formed CIA was sent to engineer a coup, codenamed Operation Ajax. Iran's monarch, the Shah, returned to power. He had previously been weakened by the new parliament, a short democratic experiment designed to limit his powers. After 1953, he returned fully backed by UK and US power, and the oil was soon flowing under control of Britain, America, the Netherlands, and France. The Shah became increasingly arrogant, opulent, and autocratic over his 25-year rule. He instilled fear in the population with a secret police known as Savak, created by the American CIA and Israeli Mossad, that tortured and imprisoned those who dared to dissent. He crushed all political opposition. Troops were sent to massacre demonstrators. He pushed a white revolution to modernize and westernize the country, giving women the right to vote and other reforms. But ultimately, he served the elites and created a huge economic gap for the poor masses. Powerful religious leaders saw that he was forcibly trying to rid Iran of Islam in a country that was 90% Muslim. One of the Shah's leading critics, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, was arrested and imprisoned for 18 months. After his release in 1964, Khomeini was sent into exile for 14 years. From abroad, he continued his anti-US, anti-Shah campaign through sermons on cassette tapes that made their way back into Iran and circulated as people copied and shared them. By the end of the 1970s, things had gotten so bad that major protests and the violence that followed were becoming a regular occurrence. The Shah declared martial law and banned demonstrations. This resulted in a huge protest and a general strike that shut down the economy. Soon over 2 million people flooded a public square in Tehran, demanding to remove the Shah and for Khomeini to return, and that is exactly what happened. One important thing to note is that the CIA orchestrated the 1953 coup out of the very same American embassy in Tehran that was later the site of the hostage crisis, right after the Shah was overthrown by popular revolution in 1979. The students were convinced that once again, the US had plans to overthrow their revolution. In fact, US President Carter did send a NATO general to instigate a military coup, but it failed. Iran and the US had an extradition treaty in force that obligated the Carter administration to return the Shah to Iran as an indicted criminal. The students had 4 demands: return the Shah to Iran for trial. He had been accepted into America for medical treatment. Return the Shah's wealth to the Iranian people. A promise from the US not to interfere in Iran's affairs in the future. And an apology and admission of guilt by the US for its past actions in Iran. The apology never came, but 20 years later, Secretary of State Madeleine Albright did acknowledge the US role in Mossadegh's overthrow. So Khomeini took power in 1979 and instituted a government under Islamic law. Within a year of the revolution, Saddam Hussein invaded Iran without provocation, seeking control of Iran's oil-rich Khuzestan region and key oil shipping waterways. The resulting Iran-Iraq War from 1980 to 1988 was the longest and one of the most devastating conventional wars of the century. At least 500,000 Iranians were killed. This war further cemented resentment of the US government, as they were playing both sides. On one hand, they were supporting Iraq, providing money, technology, and intelligence, including satellite photography, to help Iraqi bombing raids. The US helped provide Saddam Hussein with weapons by giving him agricultural credits and pressuring Gulf states to give him billions in loans, so he could buy weapons from Western Europe, China, and Russia. The US Department of Commerce issued licenses to export materials for Iraq's weapons of mass destruction program. The US continued its support even after learning that Iraq was using chemical weapons against Iran, not to mention against its own citizens, to stop an uprising of Kurdish separatists. But the imperialist tradition also called for maintaining regional balance of power. So the US also armed Iran, not letting any one regional power get secure enough to dominate or to ally with its neighbors to challenge US hegemony. In this case, it came in the form of the Iran-Contra scandal. US President Reagan needed money to fund an unjustified war against Nicaragua, but was forbidden to do so by Congress. So US arms were illegally sold to Iran through Israel and South Africa, and the proceeds went to the Nicaraguan Contras. This allowed Reagan to get around Congress to support a campaign of kidnap, rape, torture, and murder for which the US was convicted by the World Court for unlawful use of force. In other words, state-sponsored international terrorism. The ruling was ignored. Khomeini died in 1989, shortly after the war ended. He promised democracy, but essentially had become the next dictator. Although he improved literacy and much-needed health care for the masses, he also imposed censorship, violently crushed political dissent, and attacked women's rights. Instead of the Savak, the people now had the Revolutionary Guard to fear. Since then, Iran has been an oppressive theocracy. Khomeini was replaced by Khamenei, who remains supreme leader to this day.
We can see U.S. interference abroad with a recent example, Syria. For the last few years, the U.S. has directly attacked Syria by funneling weapons, money, and mercenary groups into the country through the borders of Turkey, Israel, and Jordan. The justification that the U.S. uses is that President Assad of Syria is using chemical weapons on his own people. Both Obama and Trump used children to get people to feel outrage at Syria and gets them to accept an increase of U.S. military involvement in Syria. Both Trump and Obama are salesmen, just working a different section of the population. This allowed the war in Syria to slowly expand over the course of years. In 2013, in the early years of the war, President Obama was using the idea of seeing children being gassed to death as being a red line for the world to accept and attempt to justify more U.S. intervention in Syria.
Well, I didn't set a red line. The world set a red line. The world set a red line when governments representing 98% of the world's population said the use of chemical weapons are abhorrent and passed a treaty forbidding their use even when countries are engaged in war. Congress set a red line when it ratified that treaty. My credibility is not on the line. The international community's credibility is on the line. And America and Congress's credibility is on the line because we give lip service to the notion that these international norms are important. And when those videos first broke and you saw images of over 400 children subjected to gas, everybody expressed outrage. How can this happen in this modern world? Well, it happened because a government chose to deploy these deadly weapons on civilian populations.
Later in 2017, President Donald Trump also used the same justification as Obama, but embellished it a bit more by using babies instead, as well as equating the missile attack on Syria as being a conduit to peace and prosperity there. Are we doing this because it's right?
My fellow Americans, on Tuesday, Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad launched a horrible chemical weapons attack on innocent civilians. Using a deadly nerve agent, Assad choked out the lives of helpless men, women, and children. It was a slow and brutal death for so many. Even beautiful babies were cruelly murdered in this very barbaric attack. No child of God should ever suffer such horror. Tonight I ordered a targeted military strike on the airfield in Syria from where the chemical attack was launched. It is in this vital national security interest of the United States to prevent and deter the spread and use of deadly chemical weapons. There can be no dispute that Syria used banned chemical weapons.
Referring to this same attack, the United States attacked a Syrian airbase, claiming that it had chemical weapons. There were no chemical weapons found. Syria's president, Bashar al-Assad, a medical eye doctor, explains why the airbase could not have had his sarin gas, and why they wouldn't use the gas even if they had it.
Al-Qaeda sources said that the attack happened at 6:30 in the morning, while the Syrian attack in the same area was at around noon, between 11:30 to 12. Let's suppose we have this arsenal, and let's suppose that we have the will to use it. Why didn't we use it when we were retreating and the terrorists were advancing? Actually, the timing of that attack or alleged attack was when the Syrian army was advancing very fast, and actually the terrorists were collapsing in that area. So why to use it if you have it and if you have the will? Why to use it at that timing, not when you are in a difficult situation? Logically, this is first. Second, if you want to use it, if you have it and if you want to use it, again, this is if we suppose. Why to use it against civilians, not to use it against the terrorists that we are fighting? Third, in that area, we don't have army, we don't have battles, we don't have any object in Khan Sheikhun, and it's not strategic area. Why to attack it? Well, what the reason? Militarily. Of course, the foundation for us morally, we wouldn't do it if we have it. We wouldn't have the will because morally this is not acceptable. We won't have the support of the public.
So you mean that you don't have chemical weapons?
No, definitely. A few years ago, in 2013, we gave up all our arsenal. And the chemical agency announced that Syria is free of any chemical materials.
Because the Pentagon said that there are chemical weapons in the airbase. You deny.
They attacked that airbase and they destroyed the depots of different materials, and there was no sarin gas. How? If they said that we launched the sarin attack from that airbase, what happened to the sarin when they attacked the depots? Did we hear about any sarin? Our chief of staff was there a few hours later. How could he go there if there was sarin gas? It's the same fabricated videos that we've been seeing about Khan Sheikhun when the rescuers tried to rescue the victims or the supposedly dead people or inflicted people, but actually they weren't wearing any masks or any gloves. How? Where's the sarin? This should be affected right away. So actually, this is the first proof that it's not about the president in the United States, it's about the regime. And the deep state or the deep regime in the United States is still the same, it doesn't change. The president is only one of the performers on their theater. If he wants to be a leader, he cannot, because as some say, he wanted to be a leader, Trump wanted to be leader, but every president there, if he wants to be a real leader, he later is going to eat his words, swallow his pride, if he has pride at all, and make 180-degree U-turn, otherwise he will pay the price politically.
Tonight I call on all civilized nations to join us in seeking to end the slaughter and bloodshed in Syria, and also to end terrorism of all kinds and all types. We ask for God's wisdom as we face the challenge of our very troubled world. We pray for the lives of the wounded and for the souls of those who have passed. And we hope that as long as America stands for justice, then peace and harmony will, in the end, prevail. Good night, and God bless America and the entire world. Thank you.
Shortly after the attack on the airfield in April 2017, Secretary of Defense James Mattis says that there's no doubt that Assad used gas on his own people.
Last Tuesday, on the 4th of April, the Syrian regime attacked its own people using chemical weapons. I have personally reviewed the intelligence, and there is no doubt the Syrian regime is responsible for the decision to attack and for the attack itself.
Later, in February of 2018, James Mattis says that there's no evidence of the Syrian government using chemical weapons on their own people. So there used to be no doubt about it, and now there's no evidence at all. Weird how that works. This was all part of the plan. In 2007, General Wesley Clark had an interview with Democracy Now! Where he stated that the wars in the Middle East were pre-planned.
Because I'd been through the Pentagon right after 9/11. About 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the joint staff who had used to work for me, and one of the generals called me in. He said, "Sir, you got to come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, No. He says, "We've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, "We're going to war with Iraq. Why?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do." So I said, "Well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to Al-Qaeda?" He said, No. He says, "There's nothing new that way. They've just made the decision to go to war with Iraq." He said, "I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we've got a good military and we can take down governments." And he said, "I guess if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail." So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, and he said, I just got this down from upstairs," meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran." This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq.
My fellow citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger.
And then Syria.
We had a chance to talk about a wide range of international issues, including the situation in Syria. And I have to say that all of us who've been seeing the terrible pictures coming out of Syria and Homs recently recognize it is absolutely imperative for the international community to rally and send a clear message to President Assad that it is time for a transition, it is time for that regime to move on, and it is time to stop the killing of Syrian citizens by their own government.
Lebanon.
They both had different reasons, the State Department and the White House, for wanting Israel to do it, encouraging them to do it, supporting them. Our Air Force worked very closely with the Israeli Air Force for months before this, not necessarily with a deadline, knowing when it would happen. It was always going to be whenever there was an incident, they would take advantage of an incident. The word I used was fortunate timing. When Hezbollah grabbed some of the Israeli soldiers in early July, that was then a pretext, I think that's the only word, for a major offensive that had been in the works a long time.
Libya.
Today we can definitively say that the Gaddafi regime has come to an end. The last major regime strongholds have fallen. The new government is consolidating the control over the country, and one of the world's longest-serving dictators is no more.
Somalia.
Well, violence isn't only on the rise in Afghanistan. In fact, it looks like America's shadow wars have now increased by one. Drone strikes have long been reported in Pakistan and Yemen, but now there's news that a week ago, a U.S. drone aircraft fired on 2 leaders of the Somalian organization Al-Shabaab.
Sudan.
President Obama is sending 100 combat-equipped troops to Central Africa to advise local forces on getting rid of one of the continent's most vicious operatives, Joseph Kony, the head of the Lord's Resistance Army, a group responsible for atrocities across the region. It's the first open deployment of U.S. ground combat power to Africa since the Black Hawk Down incident in Somalia in the 1990s that killed 18 troops. U.S. troops may wind up now in Uganda, South Sudan, the Central African Republic, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It's part of a growing military effort to engage in Africa.
Finishing off, Iran.
Greater detail. We see these beautiful pictures at night from the decks of these 2 U.S. Navy vessels in the Eastern Mediterranean. I am tempted to quote the great Leonard Cohen, "I'm guided by the beauty of our weapons." And they are beautiful pictures of fearsome armaments making what is for them a brief flight over to this airfield.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And you know, is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
Now that conflict has come, the only way to limit its duration is to apply decisive force. And I assure you, this will not be a campaign of half measures, and we will accept no outcome but victory. My fellow citizens, the dangers to our country and the world will be overcome. We will pass through this time of peril and carry on the work of peace. We will defend our freedom. We will bring freedom to others, and we will prevail. May God bless our country.
Yes, we came, we saw, he died. Did it have anything to do with your visit? Oh, I'm sure it did.
Okay, everyone, I'm really sorry. I wanted to make a montage scene of all the previous wars our country's been involved in. But as I was making it, I realized that it would be 4 hours long. And so I'm going to have to cut it short here and move on. But you get the idea. When it comes to war crimes committed by previous administrations, Democrat and Republican, Professor Noam Chomsky gives a brief rundown of each president and examples of some of their war crimes.
That if the Nuremberg principles were applied, every post-World War II president would be indictable.
It's probably true.
Can we run down them real fast? What did Eisenhower do that you would indict him for?
Eisenhower overthrew the conservative nationalist government of Iran with a military coup. He overthrew the first and last democratic government in Guatemala by military coup and invasion, leading to years of, in Iran it led to 25 years of brutal dictatorship, finally overthrown in '79. In Guatemala it led to massive atrocities, which are still continuing. That's after almost 50 years. In Indonesia, this wasn't known until recently, but he conducted the major clandestine terror operation of the post-war period up until Cuba and Nicaragua in an effort to break up Indonesia, strip off the outer islands where most of the resources are, and undermine what was then considered as a threat of Indonesian democracy. Indonesia was too free and open. It was allowing a political party of the poor to participate, and they were gaining a lot of ground, so that Eisenhower supported and helped instigate a military rebellion in the outer islands. This is just for starters. These are all indictable offenses.
What about Kennedy?
Kennedy was one of the worst. Kennedy, first of all, invaded South Vietnam. During the Eisenhower administration, they had blocked a political settlement in 1954 and instituted a kind of a Latin American style terror state, which had killed maybe 60 or 70,000 people by the end of the Eisenhower period, and had instigated a response, a reaction. Kennedy recognized that it couldn't be controlled internally, so he simply invaded. In 1962, about a third of the bombing missions were carried out by the U.S. Air Force in U.S. planes with South Vietnamese insignia, but U.S. pilots. He authorized napalm. He began the use of chemical weapons to destroy food crops. They began programs which drove millions of people into what amounted to concentration camps. Now, that's aggression. In the case of Cuba, it was just a massive campaign of international terrorism, which almost led to the destruction of the world, led to the missile crisis. And we can continue. Again, these are all indictable offenses.
About Johnson?
Well, Johnson expanded the war in Indochina to the point where ended up probably leaving 3 or 4 million people dead. He invaded the Dominican Republic to block what looked like a potential democratic revolution there, supported the Israeli occupation in its early stages. Again, we can go around the world. Take, say, Carter. You know,
I'll get there, but Nixon's next.
Nixon, we don't even have to talk about. We can skip that one, okay? But
Ford, then Ford.
Well, Ford was only there for a short time, but long enough to endorse the Indonesian invasion of East Timor, which became about as close to genocide as anything in the modern period. They pretended to oppose it, but secretly supported, in fact, not so secretly. The U.S., immediately after the invasion, the U.S. did join the rest of the world in formally condemning it at the Security Council. But Ambassador Moynihan was kind enough to explain to us, in his words, that his instructions were to render the United Nations utterly ineffective in any actions it might take to counter the Indonesian invasion. And he says proudly that he did this with considerable success. His next sentence says, in the next few months, it seems that about 60,000 people were killed. And then he goes off to the next topic. That's the first few months, went on to probably hundreds of thousands. Formally, the U.S. Announced a boycott of weapons, but secretly it increased the supply of weapons, including counterinsurgency equipment, so that the Indonesians could consummate the invasion. That's just a short period in office, but that's indictable. Seriously, in fact, that's a major war crime.
Carter?
Carter increased, as the Indonesian atrocities were increasing. They peaked in 1978. Carter's flow of weapons to Indonesia increased when Congress imposed human rights restrictions. By then there was a human rights movement in Congress to block the flow of advanced weaponry to Indonesia. Carter arranged through Mondale, vice president, to get Israel to send U.S. Skyhawks to Indonesia to enable Indonesia to complete what turned out to be near genocide, killing maybe a quarter of the population or something. In the Middle East, Carter just won the Nobel Prize. His great achievement was the Camp David agreements. The Camp David agreements are presented as a diplomatic triumph for the United States. In fact, they were a diplomatic catastrophe. At Camp David, the United States and Israel accepted, finally, Egypt's 1971 offer, which they had then, U.S. had rejected at the time, except that now it was worse from the U.S.-Israeli point of view because it included the Palestinians. In order to get Israel to accept Egypt's 1971 offer, after a major war and atrocities and so on, Carter raised aid, military and other aid to Israel to more than 50% of total aid worldwide. Israel used it at once in exactly the way they said they were going to do, as every sane person knew, as an opportunity to attack their northern neighbor, first in 1978, then in 1982, and to increase integration of the occupied territories. And that's for starters. We can continue.
Reagan?
I don't think we have to talk about that one either. I mean, Reagan is the first president to have been condemned by the International Court of Justice for what they called the unlawful use of force, meaning international terrorism in the war against Nicaragua. Again, that's just for starters. They also, the Security Council endorsed it in 2 resolutions, both of which were vetoed by the United States.
Bush won.
Well, we can begin with the invasion of Panama. The invasion of Panama, which, according to the Panamanians, killed about 3,000 people, since it's never investigated. We don't know if that's true or not. This was done in order to kidnap a disobedient thug who had been supported by the United States right through his worst atrocities. Noriega. He was brought to Florida and tried for crimes that he committed mostly on the CIA payroll. Okay, that's aggression. We could go into the details of the war in Iraq, but there were plainly opportunities for, they might not have worked, we don't know, but there were opportunities for diplomatic settlement, which the Bush administration refused to consider, and incidentally the press would not report, with a single exception, and Long Island Newsday, which did report the whole story throughout accurately, and is the only newspaper in the country to have done so. The Bush administration then did attack, and the attack was carried out in a manner which is criminal under the laws of war. They attacked infrastructure. I mean, if you attack New York City and you destroy the electrical system, the power system, the sewage systems, and so on, that amounts to biological warfare, and that's the nature of the attack. Then came a sanctions regime, which it's mostly Clinton, but began with Bush, which is by conservative estimates, killed hundreds of thousands of people while strengthening Saddam Hussein. That takes us off to Clinton, which that's the beginning, but that's by no means the end. We can run through it. Well, we can run through that one case suffices.
All right.
But there are plenty of others.
Bush too?
Well, let's go on with Clinton.
Okay.
And one of Clinton's minor escapades, very minor, was sending a couple of cruise missiles to the Sudan to destroy what they knew to be a pharmaceutical plant. There was no intelligence failure. According to the only estimates we have from the German ambassador and the regional director of Near East Foundation, who does field work in Sudan, both of them estimate several tens of thousands of deaths from one cruise missile attack. It's pretty serious. If somebody did that to us, we'd regard it as bad news. And again, we can continue. In the Middle East, for example, Clinton began by declaring past UN resolutions, in the words of his administration, obsolete and anachronistic. Okay, so we're finished with that. No more international law. Then comes a period called the peace process, except that during the peace process, Israeli settlement, which means settlement paid for by the U.S. taxpayer and supported by U.S. military aid and diplomacy, continually increased. The most extreme year was Clinton's last year, the highest level of settlement, the highest since 1992. Meanwhile, the territories were cantonized, broken up into small regions with infrastructure projects and new settlement. I don't know what you call that, but it's under military occupation. And if anyone else was doing it, we'd call it a war crime. And again, we can continue. Bush too, I don't think we have to discuss.
But maybe we're focusing a bit too much on presidents. Let's talk about Congress and the Senate. Today in mid-February, we can hear Paul Ryan saying that we need to increase the military budget again and cut social programs. But our military budget is huge compared to other countries in the world. Take a look at this chart. Also, the military budget has been increased over the years under Republican and Democrat administrations.
Do you consider it possible to arrive at a fiscal policy and plan that reduces the deficit without touching Medicare and Social Security or military spending?
No, you can't. It's just a mathematical impossibility. I'm doing this off the top of my head, so the fact checkers may get me, but by, I think, 2026, according to CBO, roughly all revenues coming to the federal government will be dedicated to interest on the debt, Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. And that means everything else is borrowed money. It's a function of the aging of America, health inflation. And so if you do not tackle the drivers of our debt, which are entitlements, you cannot balance the budget in the future and pay down the debt. It's just not possible. So I think it's important that we recognize this reality. And by the way, the sooner we do that, Jerry, the better off everybody's going to be, and the more we can do it on our own terms as a country, meaning, such as the proposals we've all advanced here in the House Republicans, is not touching the benefits of people in or near retirement so that we can guarantee that the promises that were made to them in retirement are kept promises. If we keep kicking the can down the road, watching the situation deteriorate even further, then unfortunately one day we could get to a point, if we have another blown presidency where we don't tackle these problems, where you have to cut benefits in real time for real seniors. We don't want that to happen. We want to prevent that from happening. And the best way to prevent it from happening is to fix and restore these programs, make needed changes for those of us who are younger so that we have something for us when we retire, and so that we can guarantee the promise to current seniors who have already organized their lives on these promises. You cannot tackle the debt crisis that's coming in America if you do not fix this entitlement problem.
Our government has no higher responsibility than to support our men and women who are in harm's way. For months now, we have been working to get our military the resources it needs to keep the peace. This budget agreement delivers on that commitment. It fully funds our national defense at levels that Secretary Mattis has requested. It provides what the Pentagon needs to restore our military's edge for years to come. As Secretary Mattis said yesterday, and I quote, "Congressional action will ensure our military can defend our way of life." Now, that mission is hard enough especially in a time of rapidly evolving threats. But our military's job has become exponentially harder because of the staggering readiness crisis that it is facing. I know I come up here and read off a whole bunch of statistics. You hear me do this every single week. This is the statistic that really gets to me. In 2017, we lost 80 service members in accidents and training incidents, nearly 4 times more than we lost in combat. In 2017, we lost 80 service members in accidents and training incidents. It's about 4 times as many people we lost in combat. Just think about that. With better training and equipment, many of these deaths could have been prevented.
Okay, we've had some time to think about it. It seems like spending billions more on the military when it already takes up more than half of our discretionary budget, while at the same time wages remain flat, rents skyrocket, homelessness increases, infrastructure crumbles, and medical costs shoot through the roof. It seems like neglecting all those other areas causes thousands of more deaths compared to the few dozen deaths caused by training accidents in the military. Also, why doesn't Paul Ryan talk about the number of military personnel that commit suicide? A number far higher than the accidents or combat deaths. I wonder why the rate is so high if they were doing the right thing, as President Obama previously described. Most of the time, the Senate and the Congress has authorized use of military force abroad when it was requested. The most recent examples include the votes of the Senate and the Congress for the use of military force in Iraq and Afghanistan. When it comes to Syria, President Obama defined the use of force being authorized in Syria as falling under the use of force agreement used to attack Afghanistan, since al-Qaeda was technically operating in Syria, even though the U.S. also funded al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups at the same time. John Kerry, Secretary of State under President Obama, a Democrat, was caught in a hot mic moment when he admitted to the U.S. letting ISIS grow in order to bring President Assad of Syria to the negotiating table.
Russia is invited in by the legitimate regime. They were invited in, and we're not invited in. We're flying in airspace there where they can turn on the air defense, and we have a very different scene. They are targeted by the opposition. We are arming. And training. The reason Russia came in is because ISIL was getting stronger. Daesh was threatening the possibility of going to Damascus and so forth. And that's why Russia came in, because they didn't want a Daesh government. And they supported Assad. And we know that this was growing. We were watching it. We saw that Daesh was growing in strength. And we thought Assad was threatened. We thought, however, we could probably manage, that Assad might then negotiate. Instead of negotiating, you got Assad. Now you got Putin to support him. So you think the only solution is for somebody to come in and get rid of Assad?
Yes.
That's the only solution.
Yes.
Who's that going to be? Who's going to do that?
3 years ago, I would say you, but right now I don't know.
What we're trying to do is help Syrians to fight for their own country. And we've been spending a lot of money, a lot of effort to try to help do this. So there's an opposition there. The opposition is doing very well. And Russia came in. That's a problem, I know, because, we don't behave like Russia. It's just a different standard. We're trying to empower Syrians to be able to fight against this guy. Now the Russians have changed the equation, unfortunately.
In Congress and the Senate, however, there are a few exceptions to the rule of accepting endless wars abroad. On the Republican side, Senator Dick Black has visited Syria and knows President Assad, and has come to the conclusion that the U.S. is funding and training terrorists in Syria.
If you look at it, there is absolutely no motive for President Assad to launch a gas attack. you look at it, he was winning the war on all fronts. Why would he launch a gas attack against women and children that he knows is going to outrage the entire world? Now think about this. If President Assad felt desperate, which he didn't, I mean, he's winning on every front, but if he felt desperate that he just had to drop bombs, he's facing armored divisions. He's facing dug-in forces of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Why would he choose to attack a handful of women and children? It's irrational. It would not happen. And I'm going to tell you, I know President Assad. I've spoken to him. I've studied him extensively as part of soft open source intelligence. And I know he is the most rational, cool-headed person you will ever meet. He is not somebody who is given to emotionalism.
When did you meet Assad?
I met him back in April of last year.
So about a year ago.
About a year ago.
Now, people were outraged. A lot of people were outraged that you went to meet him because people call him a butcher. They say he's this vicious dictator who's attacked his people before, but you don't believe that.
I really, I'm very skeptical. If you look at it, back in 2001, General Wesley Clark, who was formerly the Supreme Commander, Allied Europe, said that the Secretary of Defense issued orders that we were to topple 7 Middle Eastern countries in 5 years. None of these had taken any aggressive action against us. So we have long-standing plans. In 2007, we know that the American embassy in Damascus issued detailed plans to destabilize and overthrow Syria. And this happened 4 years before there was ever an Arab Spring at all.
So you think Assad has just been on the defense?
I think what's happened, the United States is training jihadists, terrorists, in Jordan, Turkey, Lebanon, and, Jordan, Turkey, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia. We teach them small arms, the use of TOW anti-tank missiles, and then basically they go on an open market. Many of them end up serving in ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and other extreme radical groups.
People that we've trained.
People that we've trained. This is why Representative Tulsi Gabbard, very liberal Democrat, and Senator Rand Paul, very conservative Republican, have each introduced a bill called Stop Arming Terrorists Act.
Another example of an exception to the rule of accepting endless wars abroad is Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard. She, as well as Republican Senator Rand Paul, sponsored a bill titled Stop Funding Terrorists Act. This is in response to the U.S. literally funding terrorist groups around the world, such as al-Nusra, ISIS, and other groups.
Most of the Washington establishment has been gung-ho for all this, as we just said. One of the few lawmakers who isn't is Hawaii Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard, a Democrat, who criticized the escalation as reckless and warned it could cause a much broader war. She joins us tonight from Hawaii. Congresswoman, thanks for coming on. So,
Aloha, Tucker.
You have heard media outlets that probably support you generally describe people who have qualms about what happened last night as bigots. Do you think that's a fair characterization?
We, as the American people, should be concerned when any president of the United States launches an illegal and unconstitutional military strike against a foreign government. This is something that Congress has not authorized, and it's an escalation of a counterproductive regime change war in Syria that our country's been waging for years. First, for many years, through the CIA covertly, and now overtly through President Trump's reckless military strike last night. As you know well, Tucker, this is a war that has cost hundreds of thousands of Syrian lives. It has caused millions of Syrian refugees to flee their home. And it has strengthened these terrorist groups operating on the ground in Syria, like Al-Qaeda, al-Nusra, ISIS, and others, whose sole goal is to overthrow the Syrian government, to take over and take ownership over Syria.
So this attack, last night's mission, was predicated on this sarin gas attack earlier in the week. And everyone we've talked to on this show, people with access in some cases to classified intelligence, has said unequivocally the Assad government did this, killed these children with poison gas. Do you believe that?
It doesn't matter what I believe or not. What matters is evidence and facts. And
do you think there is evidence for that?
If the Trump administration has the evidence unequivocally proving this, then share it with the American people. Share it with Congress. Come to Congress and make your case before launching an unauthorized, illegal military strike against a foreign government. You know, Iraq is not so far off in our memories, especially for people like me who not only served there, but who lost friends there. And we remember when the then Bush administration, including Colin Powell and others, came to Congress and came to the United Nations presenting so-called evidence of weapons of mass destruction that later proved to be false.
Right.
So the disaster that is Iraq war was predicated on so-called evidence. So I think it pays for the American people and members of Congress to be very careful, thoughtful, and skeptical, and to support, frankly, what the United Nations was working on yesterday before this military strike was launched, in immediately launching an independent, international, neutral investigation to gather that evidence, gather the facts, so that that can be presented.
Right. So I guess one of the differences between the early Iraq war and now is that there seems to be very little dissent on the left, or at least among mainstream liberals. They all seem for this. All the big media outlets, all the punditry on television suggests support for Donald Trump from the left. Have you noticed that? And what accounts for that, do you think?
I don't guess to know where people are coming from or why, but I really wish personally, as a veteran, that especially people in positions of power, whether they be in the media or in Congress, in Washington, to be very careful in understanding exactly what the cost of these wars are and what the consequences of a reckless action like the one President Trump took last night will result in. You know, we are seeing already how taking this action by weakening the Syrian government, the Syrian military, de facto, you are strengthening and empowering these terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda in their effort, again, to take over all of Syria. We are seeing an increase in the likelihood or the possibility that we, the United States, end up in a direct military conflict with Russia, who are very closely allied with Syria and who have their own military operating in the ground there. And when you consider the consequences of that, the United States and Russia being the two nuclear powers in the world, it should be a cause of great concern for everyone.
Yeah, you'd think, except they hacked our election, so we have to. Congresswoman, thank you for joining us. We're out of time. It's really nice to see you tonight. Thanks for doing this.
Thanks, Tucker. Aloha.
Our main problem here is that we could have made this mini documentary 6 hours long if we wanted to, just on how both political parties are similar in the area of endless wars abroad. There will be future videos on more specific topics involving military intervention by the United States. This video's purpose was to show you some similarities between the two main political parties in the area of endless wars abroad. We will also be releasing other videos of other policy areas where Democrats and Republicans are mostly in agreement and similar in their policies next. Thank you for listening to Separation of Corporation and State.